Thank you for joining us in this webinar hosted by the authors of Working with Americans, Alison Stewart Allen and Lainey Denslow. Routledge is proud to have added their book to its growing library of business-focused books. We Routledge are not the only ones excited about this book. A recent review in Edge magazines was enthusiastic in its praise, saying in part that it provides a great overview of the ladder of opportunity and key considerations for doing business in America. So we will start by introducing our authors. Alison Stewart Allen is a Californian based in Europe for over 30 years. Alison is an international business advisor, author, educator, broadcaster, and non-executive director, as well as the founder and CEO of International Marketing Partners. She has advised over 240 businesses across 26 countries to successfully internationalize, after starting her career with PwC, PA Consulting Group, and Hay Management Consultants. Besides her role over the past 4 seasons of BBC's The Apprentice, Alison appears as a regular expert for Al Jazeera, BBC News, Deutsche Welle, France 24, the FT, and many other outlets. Besides authoring both editions of the best-selling book Working with Americans with Lainey Denslow, she also creates leadership courses for corporate executives, including for clients of Saïd Business School, Oxford University, Churchill College, Cambridge, London Business School, and many other blue-chip organizations. Lainey Denslow is a leading author, international speaker, and trusted advisor on how culture shapes business practices and business protocol. Based in Silicon Valley, she is known for using human candor to help others grasp the complexity of today's global business environment. Lainey is the author of Worldwide's What to Know Before You Go, and co-author with Alison Stewart Allen of Working with Americans. Founder and principal of Worldwide's Intercultural Training and Resources, Ms. Denslow has spoken for global business leaders and organizations in the US, China, Germany, Russia, and England. She served as the Director of International Affairs for the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising and as the President of Protocol and Diplomacy International, a global organization of protocol professionals. Alison and Lainey will give you the backstory of how they came to write this book and the focus of the webinar in just a moment. But first, some housekeeping. Before the presentation starts, please have the poll page open in a tab or on your smartphone. The link has been provided in the chat box. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in your question box. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentation where our authors will be answering your questions. The webinar is being recorded and the link to the video will be sent to you on a follow-up email. The webinar video will also be available on YouTube a few days after today. Now, without further ado, I would hand it over to Alison.
That's great, Mia. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It might be the middle of the night for some of you, and it might be late evening for others. And we're really glad you're with us. So happy St. Patrick's Day. We thought it was a very good date to run a webinar like this, given our new president is of Irish descent. And since we're on the subject of Americans, St. Patrick's Day seems to be a good day to choose for today's conversation. So yes, I'm sure you're wondering, why would anyone write a book with a title like Working with Americans? And I guess if I think about, Lainey and I have been talking about this subject for several years and met when I was in Los Angeles over 32 years ago. And we're talking about this subject then. But really, we've been driven to create a book like this because we have many clients and colleagues, friends and family who are regularly asking us to help explain why Americans do certain things. Now, of course, most of these questions come from those outside of the US who are not American by birth or background, but also a number of colleagues and clients that are within the US, not originally from the country, who are grappling with the way we think, the way we do business, the way we negotiate and influence and communicate. So it's been a real treat to create this second edition, which is new. It's only been out a little over a year. to try to help shed light on this. I think we landed on a phrase, Lainey and I recently, which is frictionless friendships across the Atlantic. But Lainey, please tell us even more about our why we did this.
Well, I think Allison summed it up. We did a first edition in 2002, and fast forward to 2018, we had been talking about the fact that the world had changed, we had changed, some American approach to life had changed, and we thought it would be time to do a new update of the book. And we were extraordinarily fortunate because at that point, Routledge decided that our book would make an interesting addition to their library. So we launched on a collaboration with the Routledge and Taylor and Francis teams that has proven to be productive, creative, practical, and above all, fun. We've had an extraordinarily good experience working with the teams and with the team that brought us here today. So that's how we got here. Let's launch into our program. We are going to we have pulled out 6 points out of our book that we think are most important for people starting to work with Americans or in the midst of trying to figure out what that's all about. So we're going to talk about the American attitude of big is better, how we think about time, forms of communication, our win-win attitude, and our approach to negotiations and innovation, entrepreneurship. And then we're also going to address the issue of the American independent, individualistic attitude. So that's what's ahead of us. And Allison, now I think we're back to you.
Okay, thank you. So before we do that deeper dive, let me ask you all a question. You have a poll here where we are asking if you could let us know in a word how you would describe Americans in business. And it looks like we've got a couple of you with answers submitted. But what's interesting about this is to test and share around the globe, because all of you on this call are from all over the globe. But what's been your experience of working with Americans? And in a word, how would you describe us? So you can see some of the findings here. The larger the word and text and font size, the more frequently you all have cited that word. And I have to say, I'm very happy to see these great words. We don't always see positive complimentary words when asking this question. It's a balance. Sometimes it's not as favorable. But as you're seeing here, enthusiasm clearly comes across. We are certainly energetic. You see us as hardworking. You see us as direct, can do, determined, friendly, straight shooting, demanding. So these are all really helpful for us to set the scene for the next 6 topics and insights we're going to look at that hopefully echo your experience, but maybe even build on your experience and understand the thinking behind why we behave the way we do. So thank you so much for completing that poll. I see talkative. I think that's a cue for me to move on to the next slide. So I will do that now and hand over, if I may now, to Lainey, who will kick us off in looking at the first of these 6. So Lainey, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Allison. Big is better. So I think that Americans are known for liking things that are big food, hence the picture on your screen, big cars. We have big voices. You mentioned that we are talkative, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But certainly big is better for Americans. Big companies. We have some of the biggest companies in the world. We're the biggest economy. And it isn't just that we woke up one morning and all decided that big was better. Really, it goes back to the founding of the country. And let's look at the country as a physical place for a minute. We're big. Not the biggest country in the world, but big, similar to China, Brazil, twice as big as the EU countries combined. We go from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and we have two parts of our country that aren't physically connected to the main part of the country, Alaska and Hawaii, 50 states in total. And I think that we have been very fortunate as a country, because not only did we have all this space to create a market, a country, but also the land we have supported that development. We had lots of arable area to grow food. We have rivers and streams and transportation hubs. We have mountains, forests. Whatever you're looking for, we have in abundance in the United States. And I want you to remember that word abundance, because that is an essential part of the American view of the world, that there is abundance and opportunity. And those are themes and words that are going to go all the way through our conversation today. You know, we have a big population, 352-ish million people, and that has given us a big market. Think about it. If you had a product or service and there were 352 million people, you would believe that there is somebody out there who's going to buy what you are offering. And so we have been able as a country to look internally for the market, for the opportunities for our businesses. And we have three elements in the United States that have supported the development of this big market, big economy. We have common legal system, foundation wherever you are in the country. We have a common language, and it makes me giggle a little bit every time I think about that, because I'm sure there's somebody on the call who's traveled across the US and says, you know, you may think it's a common language, but it sounds way different depending on whether you're in Texas or New York or Oklahoma or out in Silicon Valley. But fundamentally, we have one operating language, and that's English. And the other piece is that we have a common currency. So if you are a business and doing business in Alaska or Oklahoma, it's the same currency, which makes it easy for companies to operate. Now, there's a less wonderful element of this, the fact that we have everything here at home, is that we've been, over history, somewhat insular. Now, today's a great day, a new administration, new connections into the world. But the reality is that our American colleagues may not know much about where you're from. When you're first starting to work with Americans, you may be disappointed to realize they don't know anything about where you are, who your sports teams are, what your form of government is. But the good part is we're always willing to learn. We'll learn from you about your place, about your traditions and your practices as we work with you. And that too is something that is key for Americans, is we get to know you while we work with you. I want to shift from size for a minute to shift to thinking about how Americans talk. Now, we were noted as talkative and direct in the words that came up. And you know what? That's true. We're first known usually for our big voices, you know, big cars, big houses, big companies, big voices. You can hear the Americans coming down the street when you're traveling through Europe. I'd hate to admit it, but I know that some of you are nodding your heads, and I can see Allison is laughing because she's in London and she knows this is true. But as much as we talk about big voices, I think it's important to recognize the other word that showed up besides talkative was direct. Americans are direct. Now, some of this stems from our history. We came together as people from all over. And in order to do things together, we had to find a common way to communicate. English became the language, but short and to the point became the pattern which exists still today. And it makes us very different than the style of communication around the world, wherever you travel. We are known to be about the most direct. If we want to do something, we say yes. If we don't, we say no. Let's move on to the next thing. One of the things that you'll find is we're in a hurry. And we're very focused on business. And I think another word that would describe us is transactional. And that shows up in our pattern of communication. We think that we will get to know you as we work with you. And we think we're being efficient and helpful when we're direct and to the point. But I want to add one thing to think about is that not only do we speak differently in our directness, our concern in our communication is not our relationships, but on conveying specific information so that we can go ahead, do the deal, move on. But also we listen differently, which may sound a little strange, but let me tell you out of my experience how I came to know this. And that is working with a colleague in France. When I'd send her a schedule of a visit, sometimes she'd say to me, Lainey, that looks great, but are you sure about the plan for Tuesday? Well, I'm an American, so I'm going to explain to you in data and facts why Tuesday is the right answer. And then she'd say to me, okay, if you're sure. Took me a while to learn that when she said, are you sure? She was really saying, bad idea, really bad idea. And out of that experience, I came to understand that I listened differently than she did. So if you find that your American colleagues aren't responding to a suggestion, a subtle message that you've delivered, don't be afraid to ask again, to suggest again, and to check with them if they've understood, because they're listening for data and facts, not subtle, helpful hints. And that will be useful to you to know. But I want to go back to a previous slide now, and that is our hourglass, because Americans are focused on time and task. Part of the word cloud was hardworking, and we like to think that we are indeed hardworking, serious people, focused on getting things done. If our general view of the world is that it is a place of abundance, we somehow missed that idea when it came to time, because for us, time is scarce and fleeting. We're in a hurry, and we expect everybody else to be in a hurry too. And one of the ways that is less attractive, I'd say, that Americans focus on time and task can show up is while we're happy to get to work with you, we don't necessarily invest the time in getting to know you first. There are no long lunches, no tours of the city. If we invite you to lunch, you may be surprised to find out that that invitation takes you to a conference room with a plate of sandwiches and a PowerPoint and documents to be discussed. We're just trying to be efficient. We believe that we should be thoughtful about using your time, and we expect you to be thoughtful and respectful about our time, which means that please, if we set a meeting for 10 o'clock, please be there at 10 o'clock. We see it as a sign of respect, being there on time, because you know, time is fleeting, it's scarce. We'll get to know you well while we work with you, but we're going to begin with an idea, an agreement, and moving ahead. We're in a hurry to create the next new thing and recognizing that we still think big is always better. So Allison, I think I'm going to turn it back to you. It's like an American conversation back and forth, and take us into the next issues.
Great, thank you, Lainey. So if you think about those three aspects that Lainey has just told you a bit more about, you can see how those might manifest themselves when you're negotiating. And one of the other values that's alive and well in the American business culture is structuring your proposal around win-win, making sure that the beneficiary of your proposed service or product, that they win and you win, and talking explicitly, directly, as you've said, about how everybody around the table wins. So if you think about size, which we heard about, the fact that it's an economy of abundance, there's enough winning and enough in the pot for everybody to enjoy. If you think about the point about time, by articulating what your win looks like, we save a lot of time because everyone's explicit and direct about what's in it for them to do this deal with each other. And the final one about communication, it's numbers, it's low context. The win is often a quantitative win, usually more than a qualitative win, but qualitative is just as important, but maybe talked about a little less. So that all comes together when you're in the middle of a negotiation with an American counterpart. So I think if you think about how transactional American business is, as Lainey mentioned, when you have a highly transactional business culture that's not based on the relationship first, but the nature of the win first, then we want to incentivize you to come back to us and do another deal and transact with us the next time and the next time and the next time. And when you aggregate all of those transactions, then in our view, we have a business relationship. Whereas, again, living here in Europe for the last 3+ decades, I'm a French and German speaker, as you heard in the introduction, and in many countries such as France or Spain or Southern Europe especially, it's really key you build the relationship with your counterparts first, have a lovely meal together, and then you can get down to business. Whereas in the US, it's no, let's do deals, and we do deals, and now we have a business relationship. So if I make it worth your while, if I make sure that it isn't a zero-sum game where the other parties around the negotiating table have to make sacrifices in order to fund your margin requests or anything else that you're asking for around your win, but instead you have a perception of an infinite pot to make sure everybody can win, I'm then making sure I give you a reason to come back to me for the second, the third, the fourth, fifth transaction. So that's sort of why we do the win-win game, operate the win-win game theory, which again can only work in an economy of abundance where there isn't a perception of constraints by the negotiating parties. So, you know, the win can also look beyond cash or the bottom line or a sales dollar figure. You know, a win can also be defined by you or by your American counterparts as introduction to networks, they learned something, you've entertained them during the sales process because we quite liked that part of getting to go through a business transaction. If it's choreographed, if you've done something memorable, that's all good because you want to stand out in a highly transactional business culture. So, you know, we'll remember you for all of those great things, but especially if you articulate the what's in it for them. And that should start with numbers. A second aspect, or a fifth aspect, I should say, of this American business culture is the rewarding of learning. So fail fast, fail often is an axiom that we discuss regularly. And of course, Silicon Valley has been one of the world's leading microclimates when it comes to, creating unicorns that believe strongly in, yes, it's okay to fail, but we learn something in the process and it's valuable. And the more often we iterate and mess up and integrate the learning into the next version of our product or service, the closer we get to making a lot of money and having huge success. So in other parts of the world, that's not the case. There's risk aversion. Why would we want to experiment and mess around with something that's mostly working already? Whereas, in the US, with a higher risk appetite than most other parts of the world, it's okay to try. And, if we fail, we'll apologize. We'll probably give you some money as compensation to say, yeah, that didn't really go so well, but how about joining our beta test group for version 3 of our product or service or software, whatever it might be? So we don't see it as tainting people being associated with a company that's gone to the wall and possibly has folded and declared bankruptcy. And if anything, that's another stripe that we've earned, and we're quite proud of that. We've been through several reorganizations and several corporate failures, and it's taught us a lot. And therefore, your value as an executive, in fact, the more failures you've been through, generally speaking, the more money you're going to make, because you have that experience that you bring to the next venture. So I know it's not like that in most other parts of the world, as Lainey does too, which is why we thought we would incorporate these sorts of ideas in the book. But I have to say that the view and the attitude in the States is that iterating is a positive, that we're optimistic, we value innovation hugely, we value reinvention. And so failure provides that opportunity for reinvention of yourself, but also reinvention of a company. So the final of 6 ideas to give you today is this idea of individualism. So Americans really like to think that each of us is one of a kind, and that whatever it is you're proposing, whether it's a coffee at Starbucks or it's a computer from Dell where we can configure our own components and what screen size and how much RAM we want and what keyboard we want, etc. That is our dream. So the more of a menu we're offered where we get to put our imprint and personalize the solution, the happier we will be. And that's not always easy for companies to disaggregate their value proposition into components and say, well, if you think about Nike, where you can put your own shoe together, you have to sort of explode your offering into the elements and give power over to your customer or your client and say, well, you can put together the solution that you like best. And we love that, because we've then put together something that we think is totally about us. Because at the end of the day, I'm number one as an American. It's all about me, and you are here to give me something that is purpose-made, that is tailored just for my unique needs. So options are a good idea. I mean, you'll see how we demonstrate our uniqueness. Just an article in yesterday's Financial Times about Elon Musk, who has decided that he needs his own job title, that CEO is way too generic. And now, as head of Tesla, he's renamed himself Techno King, and his finance director has renamed himself Master of Coin. So you will find job titles in American companies as well that reflect this uniqueness of, no, I'm not just any CFO or CEO or CIO. As chief HR officer, I'm actually head of talent or head of people. So we really like to have others celebrate our uniqueness. So the more you're able to do that, the much more likely you are to be very successful with your American counterparts. So on that note, you may wonder why we bothered writing a book like this. So there's a lot of reasons, but mostly because we want to help business people be even more successful in the world's largest economy. There's a lot to play for. And back to Lainey's first point about bigger is better. You know, you have a huge opportunity given Americans' openness, willingness to learn, directness, to find great enthusiasm in the country. And we are enthusiastic, as you said in your word cloud. And we will embrace your new and improved idea that you present to us, provided it, fits some of the characteristics that Lainey and I have been talking about. So we just think it's worth investing the time. We think the payback for you is fantastic. It is definitely worth the bother, given our openness to new ideas, wherever they may come from. We embrace new things. We're Darwinian at heart, and new is always better in the eyes of Americans in business. But I know, Lainey, you've got some other points to build on that too.
Well, sometimes it's a question of getting to know us. Is that in itself worth the bother? And Allison, I think that next slide, we tried to sum up why we thought we were worth the trouble, that we are energetic. And some of you picked up that we were hardworking, for which we thank you, because we think we are very hardworking, although it may not always be true. Educational, you could think about that in a whole number, an extensive set of ways, but working with us is educational, and we appreciate the fact that we get an education when we work with you. And if you can set aside the moments where we make your hair stand on end because we seem so difficult, we like to think that we're entertaining, because we think that having some fun as we work together is really important, and it makes the world enjoyable and the process enjoyable. So the other thing we didn't talk about, but I think adds to this entertaining sometimes, is we're very informal. So we want to be relaxed. Now, that may not be quite as true in New York as it is in Silicon Valley, where I am, but that's part of the American experience of, we're all in this together. Let's make it happen. Let's go ahead. Let's, the Nike slogan, just do it. We're abundant. We want everybody to benefit. So let's go forward and have some fun while we create something big, fabulous, new, and worthwhile for all of us. And on that note, I think, Allison, that we should probably give everybody else a chance to talk. So Mia, can we turn it back to you to move us into some questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Alison and Lainey. This has been indeed a very insightful presentation on working with Americans. So we will now begin with our Q&A session. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the question box, and I will pass it over to Alison and Lainey to answer. So before we move on to our attendees' questions, I actually have a question for you. Picking up from what you say on individualism and uniqueness, would you say that it might be a challenge for Americans to work in a team environment?
So that's a really good question. The answer is no, because when the goal is clear, even though we are individualistic, how that gets recognized is by celebrating each and acknowledging each team member's contribution. So teams are obviously a requirement in any organization, whether it's a for-profit, an NGO, doesn't matter. US organizations are team-based. So we don't have any problems working within teams. If anything, teams are a great opportunity to show that hard work and determination and take on a challenge. But I think the key thing to making an American team work well is, as I say, that the team itself and the leader calls out the contributions that each team member makes to make sure the team is successful. The other thing that's quite important, back to the earlier point Lainey raised about communication, the goal needs to be really clear, and the rules of the team need to be really clear. So what are the terms of engagement? How are we going to work together as a team? What are we aiming for? Are we all clear on that? And once we know what the end point needs to look like, we work backwards from that and unpack that into bite-sized pieces. So I don't think we have challenges working on teams. Maybe the challenges come when the teams are international. Back to that point Lainey raised about, we tend to be insular. We tend to assume the world is like us because we don't know it isn't. And it isn't because we're arrogant and we're insisting that our way's the right way and your way's wrong. Not at all. We just assume that everybody works the way we do. And until you tell us otherwise, we will continue with that assumption. So when it comes to an international team, we will, if it's led by an American, or it's an American, the majority on the team are Americans, the assumption will be that everybody works the same way as they do. So please help educate our colleagues to let them know that that is not the case. But Lainey, I'm sure you have some other things to add to that.
I wanted to add one thing about a change in language that has happened over the last few years that underscores this idea that Americans can and do work in teams. First of all, they learn that in school. Much of schooling is project-based, where you have group projects and you have to learn how to work with other people. But more interestingly, for me, has been a change in how people are identified within corporations. Now there seems to be a trend, instead of talking about employees, you have managers, leaders, but there is a move to talk about employees, not as employees, but as individual contributors. So right away, recognizing that everybody in the group is important, it's underscored as we recognize that everybody matters here, and so we can all come together in a sense as equals, recognizing that each one of us is going to contribute. And I think that underscores an emphasis on building good collaborative teams.
Okay, thank you very much, Lainey. Our next question we have from Doug, and he has asked, could you contrast American versus Chinese style, and what are the implications of the similarities and differences as the world moves forward?
Lainey, why don't you start with that one and I'll come in on the back, if I may?
Well, I think in my experience, one of the differences is the timing. That in a Chinese environment, it's about building a relationship first. And then the Americans are like, let's do the deal and we'll get to know you later. And for Americans need always to learn that slow it down, be patient, enjoy the process, be interested. This is a great opportunity. And sometimes it's as simple as telling a client that even if you're tired and would rather check your email, you need to go have dinner, because it's important to have dinner and get to know the people you're going to work with. And then as your clients come into America, to help them understand that if you aren't asked to dinner when you first arrive, it's because we know you'll be jet lagged and we don't want to stress you. We want you to be able to relax. So it's at what point does the personal relationship develop is one of the big issues that I see as a difference between the US and China. And also, I think we have to understand there's some differences about how the role of the boss is perceived. In America, often the boss is a coach, a mentor, a leader, but maybe not the absolute decision, the absolute ruler of the decision. And yet in China, you find much more that the boss has the final say, and you need to be prepared for the fact that some things may change from time to time. depending on how the boss decides things could change. And Allison, I'm sure you've got some stuff to add to that too.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that mirrors my experience also. I'd add a couple of other additional things. One is about the fact that because relationships count, the relationship building at the front end is key. That has a knock-on effect, of course, on time. So back to our discussion earlier when we said, Americans are in a hurry, time is money. The tendency often is to get down to business, let's do this deal. And you cannot be in a hurry in cultures that value relationship building first. How many of you have ever been in a meeting where someone said, okay, well, we've now spent 4 minutes and 38 seconds bonding. Now let's get down to business. I mean, it doesn't work like that. So you can't measure the speed of the relationship by the clock. You have to measure it by their willingness to even keep talking to you about business. So I think time is a factor here as well when it comes to the way business in China versus business in the US happens. And I guess the final thing I'd add is about the appetite for context and complexity, as it's often called in our geeky cross-cultural world. So what does that mean? It means that, Americans, because of this directness and in part because of speed and because of the language, American English is low context. What does that mean? It means we describe the foreground. When you're in a hurry, you want to just paint the fastest possible picture. So you describe what's immediately in front. You don't spend the time, because it requires time as well, to paint the background. Well, there's this person, and this person influences that person, and those two are related to this one. And then we also have the history of the organization, and all of these factors that play in the background inform the foreground. Now, in China, in most of Asia, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, lots of other places, this background context is critically important because it informs how we're going to now proceed in understanding the deal. But it generally in the US, we don't paint the background. I mean, we use phrases like, okay, and what's the bottom line? Which is, I don't care about that stuff. I just care about the numbers. Tell me the numbers. I don't need to know anything else. So it proves challenging very often for US negotiators and deal makers in business who need to, as Lainey said, slow it down, focus on the relationship building, provide the backstory, because that informs the foreground. So anyway, great question. Thank you for asking it, Doug.
Okay, so we're moving on to a few comments from Gary. So Gary would like to add that regarding China and the USA, both interest-linked have common language and common currency and common law. And also another comment from Gary, which I'm trying to scroll down and find, sorry. I think use of language is interesting. Americans describing their products using words like fabulous, amazing, and unbelievable. British Scandinavians tend to use okay, nice, not too bad.
Uh-huh.
Can I start with
a really good observation. We are known for being, I think the phrase is over the top. Remember we talked, and I think it showed up in the word cloud, about being enthusiastic, excited. And that is part of our let's think positively, let's go forward, let's enjoy. And yes, we are a little over the top sometimes. And I think, Allison, I think I'm not sure whether it's because we're such a marketing oriented, brand oriented culture that some of that use of language comes from always being thinking about branding and marketing, or whether the branding and marketing follow the language. You might have a take on that.
Well, I think it's because it's a really crowded marketplace. So there are 10 times more competitors for you in the US than in any European market. So let's take the UK, Gary. You have 10 times more people to compete against in the States. So it's noisy and it's crowded. And unless you are able to cut through that by saying, it's amazing, we're number one, we've won awards, fantastic, all of these superlatives, that's how we cut through. And I find myself advising clients this side of the Atlantic that, the volume dial is probably 5 out of 10 in Europe, and in the US it's on 11 out of 10. So you really need to think about how are you going to get that message across. So I think part of it has to do with that, and part of it is also about the culture. I mean, I was struck by watching the Oprah Winfrey interview with Prince Harry and Meghan the other week, and laughed about Prince Harry saying to an American audience, well, I was rather shocked and surprised when the security for our family was suspended and we wouldn't have security. And I said to my husband, for the American viewers, they need like a subtitle that says, I was completely annoyed and angry and think it's horrendous that they did that. But, being shocked and surprised is how it's framed. So there you go. There's an example again of the directness versus maybe the more implicit approach to communication. The direct of the Americans, and then not implicit, but very explicit, and the more implicit approaches in Europe. So yeah, thanks for asking that question.
Thank you. So we have another question from, I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, Berenger. Great presentation, thank you. When looking at it from the other side of the spectrum, what do you see happening in the US to inform Americans about how they could also be aware of the way of doing, negotiating, communicating with companies at the other side of a spectrum?
Lainey, shall I kick off this one and hand back to you?
Right, go.
Okay, well, where do I start? I think we start with kids and exposing children to foreign languages more in the United States. And yes, Spanish is the leading foreign language in the US, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily learn about cultures of the world. So I think we need to start in schools. We need to put geography back on the school's curriculum. So believe it or not, geography is not a required subject in the majority of American state schools. So that also lends to or contributes to the lack of global awareness and global mindset that generally Americans en masse in business could have strengthened. So we've got languages, we've got geography, we've got international travel. So, you might think, well, of course, gosh, we see Americans in our country on business all the time. Yes, it's the same Americans. 43, I think, % of Americans have a passport. We should have it as much higher than that. And it's we have a sort of elite group, if you like, who are the ones on the planes heading around the globe, pre-COVID anyway. Now we're on Zoom calls or go to webinar meetings like this one increasingly. But I think it's about more exposure. I also think that our news bulletins and national news, it needs to be more internationally focused. Most of the stories are about domestic events. And so, if you think about working on all three of those aspects, I think we'd go some way towards building more global mindsets amongst all Americans, including those in the world of business. But Lainey, tell us your views.
I think that everything you said is absolutely correct. And one of the elements that you talk about is so few Americans have passports relatively. And I think one of the things is we need a change in the US with the idea of vacation. So first of all, vacations are in the US a privilege. There's no legal requirement for a company to provide vacations for their employees. I know that sounds shocking, but that is true. And for most people, 2 weeks, 3 weeks is considered generous. So when you have to travel so far to get any place that's outside the US, think about that for a minute. Just in time, if you have only 2 weeks of vacation and it's going to take you a day to get there and a day to get back, that already condenses the time to go any place. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is for companies to recognize the importance of time off for exploring, learning, growing, mental health, if you will, of employees. And that if we see a greater appreciation of time off, that will in itself encourage the travel that is going to bring some of the learning that only comes when you actually stand in another place that isn't your own and have the experience of learning in place with other people. And it also requires a change of mindset of American employees who some complain about there isn't enough vacation, but studies show that Americans don't always take all their vacation time because they're concerned about face time in their companies and being in place and not losing time at work. So it's a complicated exchange, although I have a feeling that this time of confinement, if you will, thanks to COVID, where we've all been at home all the time, and companies are more aware of mental health issues for their employees, may bring some changes in attitudes about time away that would support people traveling, and with that, beginning to develop an appreciation for the global mind, the global experience.
Okay, thank you very much. We will need to move on to our final questions. However, I will pass the other questions on to Lainey and Alison to answer, and we will provide you with the answers via email. Please do let me know if you do not want to receive the email in the chat box. So our final question is, what do Americans think of British products, by John?
British products, sorry?
So John has asked, what do Americans think of British products?
I might start with that, if I may, Lainey, since I'm on site.
Yeah, yes, and then I'll add my 2 cents. Go ahead.
Yeah. Americans have an incredibly high regard for British products and services because they are perceived rightly, I think, as very high quality. So the innovation, the quality of British products and services is seen as extremely high. I think the challenge, if I may, for British companies around this is the need to match the responsiveness, match that expectation around time and the need for speed. So Americans will certainly make you feel a sense of urgency. And the question is, can a British company, or do British companies meet those expectations and urgency around, when can we get this? How quickly can you field people? And the reason I say that is obviously being here in the UK this long and working with people and British colleagues and clients, Americans may get that sense that there isn't urgency because of the way we each communicate. In the UK, if somebody asks you a question on an email, tell us more about how much it would cost to do X, Y, Z. In the UK, you wouldn't answer that email until you have the answer. And that might take a few days, it might take a week, but then you'll reply when you have the answer. From the American perspective, the silence means you didn't get the email, you're not interested, you don't work at the company anymore, the company doesn't exist, maybe it's folded and gone bankrupt. So a number of scenarios go through the American mind if they don't hear back within 24 hours, even if it's an email that says, got your note, thanks a lot, working on the answer, I'll be back to you probably in about a week, likely sooner. So that casts some doubt in the minds of the American about, gee, do these people, are they interested? There's no sense of urgency. The quality is great, the design is great, but the responsiveness is maybe not there so much. So I hope that helps shed a little bit of light. But Lainey, I know you've got some views on this too.
I think you summed it up really well. I will not add anything to that. I think you hit the important points, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's our Q&A session. Alison and Lainey, is there anything else you would like to add before we close this webinar?
Just a few things. I'll cover the first couple of points and leave the last couple for Lainey, if I may. So Lainey and I are offering a culture clinic, which is an hour's consultation, where we get to help you solve some of the problems around or challenges around your own work with Americans. We've got negotiated a special rate for that hour's session for anyone who has attended or registered for today. And all you need to do is send an email to either Lainey or I, and our emails are here. So please do get in touch if we can help you demystify this and help you structure your win-win with the Americans. Second, there is a true-false challenge called Are You Ready to Work with Americans? Which poses a dozen questions or so and gives you immediate answers on whether you got it right or not, and if true, why, and if false, why. And you just need to visit this website, this URL here, to take the challenge and see how well you are ready or how equipped and prepared you are for working with Americans. Lainey, do you want to cover the others?
Yes, of course. We, as a thank you, if you would like a taster, so to speak, a little sample of our book, there are a couple of chapters that you can download to get a sense of it. And if you want to just dive right in, our colleagues at Routledge are trying to make it easy for you with offering a discount code, as you see on the screen, if you want to order the book. So however you want to go forward, we'd love to hear from you. Even if you just have another question to add, some comments from today, you've got our email, so please do reach out and connect with us. We'd love to hear what you think. And Mia, thank you for taking us through this, and let me turn it back to you.
Thank you. This will bring our webinar to an end. I'd like to thank both Alison and Lainey again for taking part in this webinar and for answering our questions. And also a massive thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and found it informative as much as I did. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.